Welcome back to the show, Andrew Young and Jeff Maurer. Andrew Young, you are the host of Losers, Pretenders, and Scoundrels, which I
host all alone with no help.
That's right. That is your very funny history show that I'm occasionally on every single episode.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. It's a big coincidence so far. Great. Nice to have you again, sir.
Nice to be here.
And Jeff Maurer, the writer of I Might Be Wrong, one of my favorite newsletters. I just read it this morning, in fact. Welcome back, Jeff.
Thanks very much for having me.
Now, we're going to be talking about the nature of conservative humor, maybe the nature of libertarian humor. So to establish our bona fides, I believe, Jeff, since you were a former writer for Last Week Tonight, you are legally funny.
Famously conservative show.
A famously conservative show. You were legally funny. Young, you were technically funny. And I'm academically funny. Does this sound right?
I don't know that I like mine.
Well, I'll tell you. So I'm going to be interviewing a friend of mine later today. He just wrote a book on conservative humor, and I would like he's going to be approaching this from an academic and media studies perspective of looking at the history of humor and so on and so forth. I know you guys as degenerate friends in the comedy world. And right. I thought, and Young and I grew up together in a very conservative part of the country.
As degenerates.
As degenerates. We were cow tipping. And so
right.
I thought that what I want to do today is talk to you guys about, can conservatives be funny? I ask this not because I want to be condescending about that, but because I think that is a very common question for people outside of conservative groups. And also, if so, is there a difference between conservative and liberal humor or conservative and libertarian humor and so on and so forth? So, Jeff, you've been paid to be funny more than us. If we're looking at the dollar amount.
Career earnings.
Right. If we're looking at career humor earnings, you're top dog right now. Young and I have been paid to be funny, but we're kind of like minor league far team level. You're kind of a Wade Boggs, very relevant Major League Baseball reference.
Come on. That's mostly down to the Writers Guild. They really help.
Considering the baseline of being paid to be funny is free drinks, right?
That's right. Yeah.
I spent a decade getting paid in mozzarella sticks before I hit the big time, so to speak. So,
fun fact: my media assistant and editor Eric formed a union earlier this year of just him, and I asked to join it. So I am now also in a union of me and Eric.
Oh, solidarity!
Yeah,
fantastic, brother.
Power to the people, Eric. Okay, so having blubbered all of that, Jeff, what do you think about conservative humor? Can conservatives be funny? Do you think there's a difference between conservative and liberal humor? What do you think?
I think there's an insider-outsider thing, and we should reiterate that this is not a question that you came up with. This is a question that I have heard people ask as long as I've been in comedy, which goes back almost 20 years now. Why? Because if we go back to then, when I started in the mid 2000s, The Daily Show was huge. George W. Bush was in the White House. Conservatives had a lot of political power and they had a lot of cultural power. So the insider-outsider thing really put a lot of the liberals on the outside. I think there's definitely sort of an anti-authoritarian bent to pretty much all comedy. Comedy is destructive, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but
subversive.
It's you're the kid. It's subversive. You're the kid in the back of the class throwing spitballs, right? So when you're the outsider, that very much lends itself to that. And when I started, liberals were almost always the outsiders. I think that's kind of a different environment from now, when liberals are sometimes the outsiders and sometimes conservatives are the outsiders, and depends on outside of what and who are you talking about and what brand of conservatism. So yes, conservatives can be funny. It has happened before. They don't have an awesome track record, if we're being perfectly frank. Like, most comedians are liberal, and that was more true 10 and 20 years ago than it is now. But yeah, sure, it's not impossible. I've seen it done.
So I'll pick up on that, Jeff. I definitely think you're right about that, about the insider-outsider dynamic. And I think that to a large extent explains why traditionally you've seen a lot more Jewish people in writers' rooms than you have, like, white male Protestants. And that's not because there's anything ethnically endemic to being Jewish or to being Protestant that would preclude or enhance your comedy. But what I do think is, I think that, like, particularly observational comedy, like if we're to invoke Jerry Seinfeld, who is the observational comic that was the most formative in my experience, observational comedy to a great extent is not providing. This is so academic and this is so
too
boring.
late.
I
It's too
apologize.
late. You're deep in it. There's no getting out.
So, observational comedy, you're not giving people new data. You're saying, hey, look at this data you've seen. Have you thought about this outcome of the data or this pattern of the data? So, for example, like when Jerry Seinfeld says, we went all the way to the moon, and then we got in a go-kart and drove a little bit further. Like you already knew that, right? We already knew that we went to the moon. We already knew we had a go-kart. He's taking that extrapolation data, right? The reason I bring this up is I think if you are the cheerleader quarterback sitting at the cool kid table in life where the system is largely benefiting you, you are not going to be in a good position to see the inconsistencies or fallibility of the system. And so your sense of humor, if you are the cool kid, however we want to define that, if you're the insider for whom the system works, I think you are apt to have a form of humor that is pointing out aberration as opposed to pointing out inconsistency or irrationality or unfairness. Your sense of humor is going to be more along the lines of, look at that guy, what a dweeb, than like, hey, wait a minute, like, why did we have block scheduling? But what? Like, I don't know what the thing would be. I was very cool in high school.
Comedy thrives on pointing out either weird points of view that we behave with strict adherence to, or that we don't self-reflect on, right? And that's what observational humor is. It's pointing out something that we've all noticed, that we all do, but no one's really questioned in any particular way. And that's always going to, as you say, benefit from looking at the majority, because the majority is easily accessible and the minority can look at that and say, hey, look at this. This is weird. That's my technical, funny observation.
Sure. And so I think a situation where you're outside of the rhythm of the mainstream, whatever that is, you're apt to be able to call out the weirdness of the mainstream, right?
Right.
I broadly agree. I do think it should be said that, Andrew, when you were talking about people inside the system, people outside the system, those early Simpsons episodes were notoriously written by a dozen Harvard dweebs sitting in the room.
That is a very good point. That is a very good point.
Whether you are inside or outside the system can have a lot to do with who you are and your perspective than whether you literally went to Harvard, which they did.
But in some ways...
Were they white guys, though? Were they all white guys, Jeff? Answer me that.
I'm pretty sure literally all of them were white guys. Yeah. If they weren't literally all white guys in the early days, they were close.
But at least the thing that they're pillaring in The Simpsons is... The thing that they're going after in The Simpsons is the kind of middle American family, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, The Simpsons is making fun of, I don't know, the not well-educated, the common masses.
Maybe. And when we say The Simpsons, we should, The Simpsons is
early Simpsons.
They're in their 82nd season. Yeah, so they're very different eras of The Simpsons. I don't think they were certainly punching hard at, as they said on the show, upper, lower, middle class. I wouldn't say that.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, you do raise a very good point that does, to a great extent, delegitimize my hypothesis, which, as comedy scientists, we should be doing all the time. Okay, so my new revised Hegelian theory is that...
which is also what you do in social science, is you never admit you were wrong. You just, there needs to be an addendum.
You either need to be an outsider or very wealthy and go to Harvard so that you're very well connected and can do all of that. But okay, so noting that your objection is salient, I do think The Simpsons is a really good thing to bring up, because I think that the nature of like who television is catering to has changed over time. So I think if you go back to the 90s, there was more of a broad kind of inertia of what would sort of roundly be understood as sort of 50s nuclear family culture. And if you bucked against it, you were bucking against the established norm. What I find interesting about today is I don't think that insider outsider is the same thing as conservative liberal, right? So like to your point, Jeff, you could have very liberal people. I would assume the guys at the Harvard Lampoon writing in the 90s were probably mostly liberal Democrats.
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah.
Whereas now, like I've hung out with the guys from Babylon Bee, who I think are very funny. They don't feel like they're inside the nexus of American culture. They very much feel like they're on the outside looking in. And I think that's part of the reason that they're so funny is that as we've had this kind of cultural inversion, what it is to be an outsider and an insider has to a great extent flipped. And that's, I think, allowing conservatives more targets than they had when it was sort of like, well, life is how we want it to be. Listen to Dad. Let's all sit around the table.
Yeah, I agree. It's certainly the lines. I completely agree. The insider, outsider, liberal, conservative lines do not line up as neatly as they did 20 years ago. I wrote an article about the show Gutfeld, which I find interesting. Gutfeld is a show on Fox News, and it's not my cup of tea. And I'll just leave it there. It's not my cup of tea, but like. It is
the
successful.
Obama Democrat
like,
that
people
rided for last week tonight. You know, like
I know.
Go on.
It's shocking. I know. I will say that like they clearly know what they're doing over there. Like as television, like they've picked the right guests and they've got a format that works for them, and people are watching it. Which is partly Fox News has a gigantic audience and they're retaining that audience, but people are watching that. And meanwhile, the world I came from, late night comedy, and if you want to be specific, late night liberal comedy is maybe arguably not in its heyday right now. And I think that speaks a little bit to the fact that there's a little more room for conservatives to be the outsiders. Because Gutfeld is very much like a libertarian. I think he even identifies as a libertarian. It's very much like libertarian conservative, not moral majority conservative, and it kind of works.
I've hung out with Greg a few times, and he describes himself as a mugawump libertarian, and mugawump is just, I think, a random sound Greg made up to like confuse people. I'll say I think Greg is, from my interpretation, I think Greg is more of a conservative who also thinks pot should be legal. I do think that there's a difference between the two. That said, I think he would agree with you that he's not coming in from, like, I'm sure that Greg has no problem with gay people, for example. I would be very surprised if Greg doesn't have lots of gay friends, and probably hung out with Shep Smith back in the day. So to add to our conversation a little bit, I almost feel like when it comes to comedy, that the word conservative is conservative and liberal is almost a poor choice. Like it makes sense if we're talking about like economics or something, but I feel like for broadly speaking in comedy, status quo tends to be equated with conservative, which makes sense because conservatives are conserving something. But if the status quo is liberal and the conservatives are the insurgent, then the people maintaining the system can be liberal. And then I feel like there's almost like so you could have like status quo, you could have change or subversion, and then you could almost have like orthodoxy of like the thing I wish the world was in a sort of Platonic sense. And you can see these play out across the spectrum.
It kind of seems like to me that if you look at it from that lens, that what we see today with this kind of switch where you're seeing a mix of liberal and conservative comedy, using those terms loosely, is partially because most of the institutions that liberal comedy used to go after have been pretty well torn down, whether that's the church, economic institutions, the modern family being what it was in the 1950s. There's a lot of those things that have gotten the broad shot of liberal comedy, and so now it's kind of like, okay, well, what else can we go after? What behaviors can we look at? Because we spent so many years going after those institutionalized elements of our society, and we've entered the malaise part of our our culture.
Carter.
Right, but yeah, like we're disillusioned with a lot of these institutions that used to be sacrosanct.
Well, okay, that actually reminds me, because I want to go back to a point that you made earlier, Jeff, that I get confused by. And so this isn't a loaded question. I am very curious about this and trying to understand it. I come more from the libertarian perspective. I have a lot of libertarian leanings, right? So I agree that comedy is by nature subversive and sort of getting into the cracks and overturning orthodoxies. That all makes sense to me. The anti-authoritarian bit, from my perspective, like when someone goes, I'm anti-authoritarian, therefore I want a bigger government, that doesn't make sense to me. Because I'm like, well, that sounds like you're just a different flavor of authoritarian. But I don't think that's how they're thinking or how you're thinking. So like, explain that to me as somebody that voted for Gary Johnson.
I am the Gary Johnson voter whisperer. I'm the right person to ask about this. So how to answer that? I would say that there's certainly such a thing as an orthodox liberal, right? There is such a thing, I think, especially nowadays I think it's undeniable that liberals have a lot of cultural power. That's a fuzzy phrase, and yet it describes a thing that we all kind of recognize, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. There's such a thing as an orthodox liberal, and going down your liberal talking points, which to me is the most boring type of humor, most boring type of political humor. If you're just going through your MSNBC liberal blue talking points and hitting those and then tacking some jokes on at the end, that is very unfunny. Why is it unfunny, in my opinion? Because it's so orthodox. Because you are, confirming the orthodoxy. You're not doing the thing that comedy normally does, which is to kind of question things and tear down.
Right.
So I would say it's probably true that comedians, whether you put them on the left or you put them on the right, they probably all have that libertarian bent. And I would say in my experience that's true when I think of the comics that I've known. I mean, I'm on the left, but I'm, like you, very socially liberal. And I think the ones you find on the left do tend to be like quite socially liberal. I mean, when I was starting in the mid 2000s, like jokes about like, why are we being such dicks to gay people? Like that was a very rich vein of humor because it was a good point. Like, why are we being such dicks to gay people? And the comedians I knew who you'd put on the right also had that, libertarian bent. They were not your, Pat Robertson moral majority type of person. They were more, pro drug legalization and things like that, which we mentioned Greg Gutfeld, like he's in that vein. I think it's not too surprising. So yeah, perhaps left-right is less instructive, especially nowadays, and sort of subversive versus, authoritarian, if you want to use the harshest word you could pick. Yeah. Maybe that's a more interesting metric.
There's sort of I like where your head's at, Jeff. So it's not authoritarian necessarily in the sense of political accumulation, where we're describing the ideal size of government relative to GDP or something like that, but rather just a kind of innate propensity towards subversion and contrarianness, which makes sense. Yeah. I would also assume that if you were to get a bunch of funny comics together from any political persuasion, one of the people in the room is going to start being the contrarian when they all start agreeing with each other, if not everybody. So that does make sense to me that that's probably endemic to it. Yeah.
I kind of would like people to know that the Last Week Tonight Writers' Room, which is, John's not in that. That's just the room. Last Week Tonight Writers' Room would talk about anything. We would have debates about anything. And, people watch the end product and they assume that you probably have a very, orthodox, and orthodox might be a better word than authoritarian, orthodox writers' room. No, we talked about everything. We debated everything. It was thoughts were open and freely flowing in that writers' room.
That whole room got canceled.
We are literally all canceled now. Yes,
that's why Jeff's on my show. This is the re-microwaved remains of comedian detritus show. Yeah. All right, so I'm gonna get even more academic and wonky with you, and I'm gonna throw something at you. Longtime listeners of the show know that every other episode, Wallace. Sorry, I just adopted a dog, and he is angry that we're not going on a stroll right now. I will make a note of that. That way it doesn't sound like I'm a dick. We'll cut that bit out.
Cut out the 5 minutes where you're beating your dog audibly over the podcast.
It's really
he just fold this in as an anti-authoritarianism bit. Wallace is standing up against you, the authoritarian owner of him.
Okay. So long-time listeners of the show will know that I invoke Arnold Kling all the time. I feel like Arnold Kling has a really, really useful way of understanding liberals versus conservatives versus progressives. If you listen to the show regularly, this is your opportunity to drink because we've hit that part of the drinking game. But in a nutshell, progressives tend to understand and communicate the world in terms of oppressor versus victim. Conservatives tend to understand and communicate the world as civilization is under duress, be it from foreigners, from terrorists, from invading armies, or from moral entropy at home. Libertarians tend to understand the world as coercive versus voluntary. So noting that's kind of the quick shorthand reference I have for analyzing, like looking at something and going, oh, that's a conservative way of looking at it. So like if you said, I'm for pot legalization because it's my body and I should be able to smoke in my own goddamn home, that's a pretty libertarian way of looking at it. Whereas if you said, like, I'm in favor of pot legalization because it's the criminalizations disproportionately hurt black people, and it gives cops too much power. Well, that's a very progressive way of looking at it, right? So that's where I'm coming from. So that being said, I think King of the Hill would qualify as a conservative show by that metric. I think that King of the Hill has a patriarch of the family who's generally wise about the big things and is wrong about ephemeral things. He is kind of common sense versus pointy-headed newness is a lot of the time the pittance going on there, and he is sort of the stand-in for decent, wholesome American culture that's running up against things. Is this a fair assessment? Would you guys say King of the Hill is a conservative show, or am I just projecting my stuff onto something?
I would agree with at least 90% of that, and I'm trying to think about the last 10. I would certainly agree with
good.
all the way.
90%.
It's not bad.
Yeah,
it's not bad. I certainly agree with the way you described it. Yeah, it is sort of a sensible, level-headed guy who they make fun of him for like 21 minutes, and then in the 22nd minute he does the right thing in the end, and
right.
which is why you can make fun of him for the first 21 minutes, because he is the good guy in the end and he does the right thing. Mm-hmm. And you're also right that a lot of it is making fun of pointy-headed. It's putting this guy who's very much from the old Texas and putting him in like Austin and having him interact with that person, and hilarity ensues. Whether or not that's conservative, I mean, I see why you would say that. Maybe, yeah, he's certainly he's the good patriarch. Does that make him conservative? That's the 10% I'm not
maybe.
Sure about.
Yeah, Young, please jump in.
I feel like it runs up against the kind of common problem with narrative comedy, which is at the end of the day, you have a set of characters that you're going to watch and you're going to like. If they don't grow or change at the end of the episode, that tends to, which we'll get to Rick and Morty in a minute. If they don't grow and change over the course of the episode, sometimes that can be an unsatisfying journey to keep going on with these characters. So even when they make boneheaded decisions, you still have to kind of end with them coming to some realization about why those decisions were boneheaded. But in the contrast, or the downside of that sometimes is that it makes your person look like you connect with that person more, right? So it can come off as you being in favor of that character who's making these boneheaded decisions when they learn something at the end, even though you're basically showing them with all their warts and everything, but we're connecting to them because they are our protagonist. Does that make sense?
I think so. I'll add that one of the reasons I bring this up is, I don't think there's, to clarify in case this didn't get established at the beginning of the episode, I don't think that there's anything inherent about being inherently difficult about being conservative and funny. For example, Kelsey Grammer is very funny. He's a very funny comedic actor. So it's not like I think a lot of the time, Matt and I will probably discuss this. A lot of the time, antagonistic progressives have a emotional reason to say, well, no, like that's our thing and no one can be funny but us. And so I've had this conversation with a couple of friends that immediately are like, no, King of the Hill's not conservative because it's funny. And I'm like, you're
well, let me ask you this. Not that I
Okay.
want to sidetrack the conversation. Is Frasier a fairly conservative show because he is a egotistical, self-possessed liberal bonehead throughout most of the show? And most of the people around him are, and probably the most sympathetic and reasonable character in the show is his father, Martin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Who I
funny
would say
you
is
should
kind
mention
of a-
this, Young. And thank you for allowing me to plug in the Patreon plug for this. About 6 months ago, I took a break from doing bonus episodes on the show and just did, I think, 5 episodes of the Frasier Cranecast, where for bonus episodes behind the paywall, I talked to a writer from Reason, Christian Britschke. We just talked about, literally just talked about Frasier. And one of the questions that we had, Young, was, is Frasier a rich people show, or is it making fun of rich people? Is it lampooning snobbery, or is it?
Where'd you land on that?
Yeah.
I think it is a show for smart people making fun of smart people. Like you can almost
I
have
think
like a
that's right.
Foursquare.
Yeah.
So like for example, I'm going to sound like a dick here. I don't think that The Big Bang Theory is a smart show. It's a show about smart people. I don't think it's a smart show, right?
Agree.
Whereas I think
Hard
Frasier
agree.
is a smart show making fun of smart people.
Yeah.
And there's definitely that economic dynamic, or like snobbery is a big thing. I don't see politics being a big part of it. Definitely snobbery versus common sense.
ego, thinking that you're always in the right. And I think the show kind of has a bit of a negative view on psychiatry and psychology. It doesn't necessarily paint it in the best light.
Well, actually, fun tidbit, Young, that you listeners can find out if you go on Patreon and go back 6 months to listen to the Frasier Cranecast Behind the Paywall. Originally, they were going to set Frasier in Denver, Colorado. This is back in the late 90s. They decided not to do it because at the time, the state of Colorado had passed an anti-gay marriage law, and they did not want to set it there for that reason. So they put it in Seattle instead, not because Seattle is the greatest bastion of cosmopolitanism and elitism the world has ever known, as you would think, having watched Frasier, but because it was far enough away from Boston that the writers weren't worried they were going to make it Cheers Part 2, and it wasn't set in what they viewed as a homophobic state. So there was some politics going into it, but I don't know. But by my definition, Young, I don't know whether how I would qualify that. I don't think that the vibe of Frasier is little guy versus big guy, so I don't know that I'd strictly speaking call it a like kind of progressive humor.
The reason I ask is because I see a reverse connection to King of the Hill in a lot of ways, because Frasier as a character is making these very self-possessed decisions, but I think he would describe himself as a intelligent, cosmopolitan, to use this word even though I think it's the wrong word, elitist kind of character, and he makes a boneheaded choice through 22 minutes of the episode, and then the last minute is him coming to terms and growing throughout the end of the episode. So it's kind of like, I feel like it's a complimentary episode or show to King of the Hill.
I think one thing we should keep in mind is that people like to laugh at themselves. People like to laugh at themselves. Heaton, you're a stand-up. Andrew Young, I don't know if you've ever done stand-up, but when you go on the road,
no, not ever.
The first thing okay, well, let me tell you some war stories here. When you go on the road, the way you open your set is with a couple minutes of jokes about the town that you're in. Or if you're at a college, make fun of the college. Do they have a good football team, bad football team? Make fun of that for a while because people eat that up. Mm-hmm. They want themselves to be made fun of. Mormons love the Book of Mormon. I mean, most of them do. They find it very funny. So I think it's actually, it's interesting.
Jeff, I could actually pull out a Maurer line from back in the day when I first met you, when you were doing like the Buddha Room or whatever of Kurt Shackelford's. You'd do some crowd work. And if there were college students, you'd ask, where are you guys at? And they'd say like University of Maryland or whatever. And you'd go, oh, the University of Maryland. No, that's a great fallback school. Like that's a really good backup school. Like it was real quick, but like for sure. I remember you doing this back then.
That later became, I would call it, the Harvard of safety schools is how that's what that line evolved into. Yeah, because nice. you're kind of making fun of them, but people really roll with that, and really way more than you might think.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about Frasier and you're talking about King of the Hill and who's watching these shows and enjoying them, I think part of it is liberals are watching Frasier and laughing at him, and conservatives are watching King of the Hill because, like, what, you're telling me there's not something funny about those two characters? Of course there's something funny. And I feel like I actually have a little bit of a foot in both camps because we moved a lot growing up. So I grew up partly in the South. I was from Kentucky and Southern Virginia, but then I also lived in Seattle for a little while. And then I did go to college, and like the Frasier character is funny. Overeducated people can be pompous and funny. And Hank Hill is also funny. Like he's got his things that he loves, and he so doesn't want to go outside of the world. Yeah, that's funny. And I think it's not people laughing at somebody else so much it is people laughing at themselves.
No, for sure. Hank Hill is the antithesis of an acid trip. Like imagine somebody doing LSD to expand their mind. The exact 180 opposite of that is Hank Hill. And I think part of the reason that works too is that it's poking fun at him, but he's part of our group. Same with Frasier, right? Like it's an in group. Yes. It's an in group self-depreciation as opposed to an out group. I'm going to crap on you because I'm very similar to you, Jeff. Like I live in these like bright neon blue cities. I'm cosmopolitan. I'm wearing a blazer. I own a passport and a fake passport from a country that no longer exists. But I grew up in Oklahoma, and I watch King of the Hill, and it's like watching a documentary about my cousins and my uncles. Like there's this line on King of the Hill. It's one of the funniest lines. It's a throwaway line. They're debating getting they've got to get their dog, or their dog. There was a pregnancy scare, and his wife is chastising him, and she says, "Well, you need to spay our dog or pay someone to do it for you." Like, it's just the fact that would even enter the mindset of like, well, it's your dog, you should do, like, I'm like, yep, I know those kind of folks who are just like very practical. But it ends up being it's sort of highlighting your own internal absurdity versus like making fun of the other, which
because it can get mean when you're. Yeah.
Which brings us to South Park, which I do feel like is really going out of its way to make fun of other people. And while we might have our favorite characters, they are almost like a vanguard going into religious conservatives or progressive politics or whatever and making fun of them. Now, I would say, I think that according to my Arnold Kling metrics, that South Park is broadly libertarian flavored. And I mean that in the sense that if you had to pick one of those models, I think it's more concerned with voluntary versus involuntary. I think Trey Parker and Matt Stone have alluded to having kind of vague libertarian sensibilities in interviews before. That said, I do not think they've ever set out to write a single episode of how do we prove libertarian. Like, I don't think they ever had any of that. I don't think
comedy is king on that show.
To use another phrase that we've invoked in this episode, which I think is very useful, I do not think they're orthodox remotely, nor do they care about upholding, like, they're not thinking about Hayek. They're not thinking about any of that stuff, right? But I would say I think that they've actually been a fairly successful example of libertarian thinking in pop culture. What do you guys think? Am I right in that regard, or am I projecting my own Gary Johnson values onto a beloved show?
I mean, I feel like libertarian feels like a loaded word to use because it feels so innately political at this point. But I would say anti-orthodox is 100% the correct way to go. They're looking at anything that is an accepted norm, either because it's being told to us that way or because we haven't examined it, and saying, this is silly. Especially if people lean into it really, really hard, they're going to lean into it the opposite direction. The thing that I think really makes it keep working, though, is I'm sure that some people will say that they do find it this way, but I don't find South Park to be particularly mean, because I think, with the exception maybe of a few characters, they deeply love their characters, and we walk away liking even the most monstrous character on that show. And so it doesn't feel as... Yeah, poor Kenny. It doesn't feel as mean as it could. It is obviously snarky, and it's using analogous storylines to point out the snark, but it's also somehow earnest in its own way, which means that it doesn't feel detached and disconnected and hateful to me in an odd way.
So a couple of responses to that. The biggest thing I've got from talking to you guys is I think orthodoxy versus unorthodox is a great metric in comedy. Because I'm with you. I would say that they're very anti-orthodox. Whatever the calcified, ossified groupthink is of the day, whatever the trend is, whatever the bandwagoning is, they're going to try and rip the wheels off that bandwagon, right? So very anti-orthodox. Libertarian's probably not the right way to describe it then, because I'll say people that identify as capital L libertarians tend to be extremely orthodox in their thinking. They tend to have a very, very specific, very rigid idea of how libertarianism works and how the world should work. And we're going to interrupt the movie Spider-Man to talk about why the non-aggression,
right.
So
you only say that because you've been to the conventions, which all of them show up to.
This is true. I've got some experience in this world. They are definitely anti-orthodox, though. There's no orthodoxy that they are meaning to uphold. That being said, Young, I do feel like I do think they can be mean. I don't know that that's unwarranted, but I do think it's interesting in that South Park to me is sort of, if we were to make another spectrum of like aloof and snarky on one end versus earnest on the other, I feel like they are kind of pretty far to the aloof, snarky side of things, where If you are like, everybody loves Pokemon this week, they're going to make fun of Pokemon and how ridiculous it is that we like Pokemon. Whereas like Ted Lasso or the Detroiters would be on the far other end of that extreme of like, earnestness is great. And like, I love riding bicycles and I love baseball and there's nothing ironic about it. I just think baseball's fun, right? So I do think like they're very far on that side of it.
Right, but I feel like the majority of, now granted I'm not as caught up very recently in their seasons, but the episodes that I always kind of harken back to in the not the early days, but the days of South Park where they were being more present and attacking things that were in the zeitgeist, I still feel like they kind of ended each episode with a character having some sort of moral, earnest revelation at the end, and in a way that kind of like, it didn't undercut the message of the episode, but somehow it made it so that it didn't feel as though it was just snark. Does that make sense? They couched it.
I feel like I'm sure they did that sometimes. I feel like a lot of time they were making fun of that. I remember they used to end a lot of episodes. I don't think they do this anymore. They used to end a lot of episodes with, I learned something today. It was usually right. Kyle. I learned something today.
Absolutely, when I'm putting that after school special, yeah.
Yes. Well, and not only after school specials, but often, a lot of sitcoms, like every episode of Full House ends with somebody learning something, and it's often very explicit in a way so explicit that a character might turn to camera and say, I learned something today.
Right.
So yeah, they definitely make fun of that. Maybe they've had their more sincere moments.
I always read that. I mean, I knew that they were making fun of that at the time that I'm watching the episodes, but somehow it still felt kind of legitimate. I don't know. It walked a weird line for me where I'm like, yeah, this character is making fun of a convention, but at the same time, I think they would end up saying a message that is like, oh, we should learn to understand each other. We should all care about each other. We should accept that people come at it from different point of view. And I'm like, I think the writers kind of believe that, even though they're couching it they're putting it in this joke. It's weird. I feel like they walk that line.
You have more faith in the moral wholesomeness of South Park than I do. For the record, I'm not even saying it's bad. I also have not watched it in a couple of seasons, but I like South Park and I have enjoyed it historically. I don't feel like there's been a good moral lodestone. However, that said, Young, I do feel like there's a different, even if they're merely affecting that arc, and it is lampooning it, that's still different than, say, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where there's the moment where you think the character's going to turn and have some sort of moral revelation, and then reliably goes back to being a dirtbag.
They never do.
There's just absolutely no learning.
Let me say, I think there is absolutely a place for comedy that it's like just nihilistic and there's no moral, no point, no sincerity. And maybe it's because I was born in 1980, so all the sitcoms I grew up with, the Cosby Show would be the classic, and then Full House would be another. Like, they all had this moral center where, yes, the character does learn something at the end, and there is an earnestness to it, which the writers at the time, and if you are the type of person who watches interviews with old sitcom writers like I do, you know that was a very explicit part of what they were doing. They were conscious, like, yeah, you have to have that moral center to the show. The fact that some shows don't have that at all, and maybe South Park is one of them, Sunny is also one of them. I would say Arrested Development, one thing there was never an earnest turn. And there was a moment at the end of the one with, at the end of the whole Charlize Theron arc, she walks, you either know this scene or you don't. She walks across the pool, and Michael turns to Job, and he says, "Oh, Job, that was your trick, right?" And Job says, "That wasn't my trick, Michael."
Oh,
and they
man,
fade
the
out.
suspense of this is
and
killing
you think,
me.
Oh my God. For the first time ever, they've had an earnest moment
Jeff,
on this show.
I'm sorry,
and then they fade back in, and Job says, "That was my illusion," and he shoots a fireball, and Tobias catches on fire. They completely torpedoed the idea that they were going to have a sincere turn. Did I fade out?
I think you're okay. Actually, did you get through the whole thing and manage to say what you were saying before you heard me?
I did, except that I paused at the end. You can edit that pause out. Did I freeze?
You did, but it should be okay because it's Riverside. It'll upload it, so it's okay. And I'll add to this too that, like, from my perspective as a comedian, I think a lot of the time when we're talking about conservative humor, liberal humor, like whatever the thing is, we're importing this idea that humor also needs to be understood the way we understand the political world, which is there's winners and losers, and we've got a team we're rooting for and a team we're rooting against. Whereas I view comedy more like just like restaurant options. Sometimes I want to get like I want, like, I love Zucker Brothers, right? Like, so I'll go watch the zany thing, right? But then maybe I'm in a wholesome mood and I want to have like a sense of earnestness and I go watch Ted Lasso. And then I want that kind of nihilistic, ridiculous, who gives a crap vibe of South Park or It's Always Sunny. So it's not like I want one of these to win and I'm like, oh, I'm anti Ted Lasso. I'll say culturally, I think that we've kind of peaked out on snark, and I think we're beginning to go the other direction. But it doesn't mean we can't have snarky humor.
Twitter delivers a lot of snark.
Yeah, I'm the same as you, Heaton. I can't spend too much time in one type of humor before I get burnt out. Like, I had to stop I was watching a bunch of Veep all of a sudden, and I was like, man, I am exhausted with how monstrous these people are. Or, I'll binge Ted Lasso and be like, okay, I need to just step away from the floaty cloud world that Ted Lasso exists in. Yeah. And so I have to vary it up too. You can't spend too much time in one type of comedic world before you just get a little burnt out on it, I think.
Yeah, and I also see benefits to having those viewpoints politically too. Like, I am glad that The Onion and the Babylon Bee exist. I think they're both very funny. I can see like the Babylon Bee skewering some liberal pieties that like we ought to like question, and I can see The Onion also skewering a hypocritical conservative. And I have a big enough mind that I can laugh at both of these jokes rather than like grit my teeth when I see them. Like, sometimes I'll see a joke that I'm like, I disagree with the fundamental premise of the joke, but it's a funny joke. Like I've had a couple of people send a tweet to me this week, and I'm like, that's a good tweet. I don't agree with it, but that's a funny tweet.
It's interesting that you mentioned The Onion, Heaton, because I would say The Onion has evolved quite a bit, and so is Clickhole, which is newer, but still The Onion group. The comedy that I see on those two things tends to pillory left a lot lately.
Clickhole's amazing in that capacity, and kind of similar to South Park. It's like the Onion has always been good, I think, at being able to notice feckless bandwagoning. And to point that out of like when people are just doing a popular thing because it's popular and they want to be popular too, being able to point. South Park's great at that. Like, I think South Park's very, very good at seeing when people just jump on a bandwagon and want credit for it and attacking them for it. I think Clickhole's also done that. But I do want to move on to another one. Young, you mentioned earlier Rick and Morty, that we would get to that. So let's go ahead and move on to that. How would you describe Rick and Morty's politics, if it has it, or its worldview or whatever?
I think you're marking it as nihilistic is 100% correct. And I think that's a byproduct of, it's a byproduct of storytelling for one thing, because we've gotten to the point where now we have all these multiverses and how many versions of yourself exist. And are you a product of your choices or you're a product of your environment? And who knows? It doesn't matter. And that show, every episode pretty much ends with them not learning much. Rick is somehow this character who just gets away with being smarter than everyone else and murdering people, and it's completely okay. And then everyone around him is a little bit horrified, but kind of adapt to his point of view.
Mm-hmm. And I love Rick and Morty, by the way. I think it's really, really funny. But I do think it's a nihilistic show. Like, I have libertarian friends that love it and think it is libertarian because it seems to be making fun of conservatives and progressives. And I'm like, it is, but it's making fun of everything. Like, if Gary Johnson were president, it would be making fun of Gary Johnson. And I think Dan Harmon's actually been fairly explicit about this, that Rick is meant to be a nihilistic character. He's a character that believes nothing has meaning. Everything is a nonsensical piety put on by liars, hypocrites, and fools, and settling into this reality of just very, very cynical, I don't care, which I find funny. Again, this is like antithetical to Ted Lasso's worldview, but still really funny. Mm-hmm. But I would say it's more nihilistic than anything else. It's Joker lighting a pile of money on fire.
Yeah, I agree with that. I wonder if we're these shows that people think like, oh, that's a libertarian show. If they think that just because it has neither an obvious Republican or an obvious Democrat point of view. If you're going after both the right and the left, maybe that's what causes people to think, oh, well, then it must be libertarian. It must be that weird third choice.
And I'll add to that this is a ongoing, regular frustration in my life is most people, it's very difficult for most people when you get into politics to understand that maybe there are more than two options. So I find that consistently conservatives think I'm center-left, progressives think I'm center-right. And I'm like, well, option one is that I am just this limp-wristed centrist. That's a possibility. But option two is that your spectrum's broken and you're trying to cram everybody onto a left-right spectrum that is not actually applicable to all situations. And so you were falsely trying to put me into a dynamic that just doesn't work.
Yeah.
I get the same thing. I get the heterodox liberal label all the time.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone's familiar with my Substack, which is I might be wrong, there's your plug. It's heterodox liberal, which is such a funny phrase because I almost feel like heterodox liberals are a majority of liberals these days. Maybe not a majority on Twitter, but like in the real world, I think we're a majority. So how is that? Heterodox? Aren't we the norm? But maybe it's just, people who do hew strongly to the orthodoxies are a little flummoxed by somebody who doesn't, and maybe has difficulty understanding you and difficulty placing you on a political spectrum.
And I get the, hey, what's your deal?
Well, tell you what, I think I will go ahead and wrap it up there.
I did want to ask one question, though, Heaton, because we posed 3 cartoons that could be, somewhat center-right, nihilistic, whatever. Can you point to a cartoon show, and let's go with a cartoon show with a long set of running characters that seem to have at least a somewhat continuing storyline that skews specifically liberal?
Interesting. So while I gather my thoughts there, Young, I think that you can, depending on how we're using these terms, you can sometimes be a liberal conservative, if that makes any sense. But by which I mean, say, like, we're talking about orthodoxy, right? Mm-hmm. Like another dynamic we could have, rather than using liberal and conservative or progressive and conservative, I think a dynamic you can use to assess situations would be radical versus reformist. The radical says the house is full of termites, let's burn it down and make something new. This thing is corrupt. The reformist says we're going to do incremental changes to try and fix this thing. So like in Trump versus Hillary Clinton, Trump's the radical, Hillary's the reformist. She is in the sense of status quo.
She wants to put a termite tent over America.
Yes, she's the Termite Queen.
And that was her slogan, which was could have done better.
I'm the Termite Queen.
I want to put a termite tent over America.
Yeah.
Termite Queen.
So I think you could have.
Remember, she would show up at events with a crown, and people were like, "What's with the crown?" You're like, "I'm the Termite Queen." You're like, "Oh, I feel like this is a misstep."
Also, I'm going to drag this out just a little bit longer, Young, to try and get my thoughts and give Jeff some time to come up with a better answer than me. Under AP newspaper guidelines, Young, you know AP?
Yeah, big Associated Press fan. Always have been, always said that.
So under AP guidelines, or at least whatever the British equivalent is, you're not supposed to say the Queen. You're supposed to say Queen, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, at least in British publications, right? So like right when word processors came out, a lot of the media companies in the UK put in these automatic things where it would just automatically change whatever text you had in your article from the Queen to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. And it was automatic. So you'd start
seeing
these
articles. Would that happen when
articles,
they wrote articles about Queen the band?
Exactly. Like my favorite one, like the exact quote is like, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II has over 40 male drones that inseminate her, and she leaves over 20,000 eggs a year. And like nobody would catch it. It was great, right? So that's my Queen joke.
That's great.
In terms of
Freddie Mercury, member of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, has died today.
So Young, actually, I will say I can think of a very good example of a progressive show. I don't think that it would actually. I think it would run afoul of my Arnold Kling model. But I would say Parks and Rec is, to me, very progressive.
That's not a cartoon.
No, it's not a cartoon. But when I think of Parks and Rec, though, Leslie Knope, who is the protagonist, and by the way, I love Parks and Rec. Leslie Knope embodies the worldview of, hey, government is coming together to help things, and and takes like a very rather statist position quite a lot. Like that is very like no one really obviously Ron Swanson questions that, but like there's a scene in there where they're debating whether to outlaw giant jugs of soda. Like because the local hamburger company has these like bucket sizes of soda, and they're making fun of like, isn't it ridiculous that this is big? And they're like, well, we think that people should be able to drink this much, and like it could be healthy. And the joke of it is, of course, the government should outlaw such large sodas. Like the government's here to protect us from bad decisions. And like, whereas my inner Ron Swanson just rankles at that and is like, I do not want the government to protect me from myself. I want it to protect me from bears, communists, and burglars, but I don't want it to protect me from myself. So I would say that would be, I think The Simpsons probably would be, just based on the people participating in it. Although I think it would also kind of run afoul of that Arnold Kling model, Young, because I don't think that the plots to The Simpsons don't tend to be little guy being stepped on by big guy and little guy triumphing. It tends to be interfamily dynamics and things like that. But
right.
What
about Family Guy?
I feel like that's more nihilist. That's more in the nihilist category again.
Yeah, I see. I haven't watched Family Guy or American
Some
Dad.
of these jokes, some of these
about a
shows are
decade
joke
now.
buckets. You know, it's like if you ask me what's the political valence of 30 Rock, it's like none. It's just a joke bucket.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I would say American Dad probably is written to be a kind of attack of the gung ho.
Yeah, I was going to say American Dad
for
strikes
the
me as like
military,
orthodox liberal, of like we have our things that we are making fun of.
When did that start? That feels like a classic War on Terror show, but I feel like it was maybe
04,
2010.
05.
Okay, yeah, that's when that should have started.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so what we've learned so far is orthodox versus subversive is a very useful tool in humor, and also that my Arnold Kling model doesn't really work for comedy very well, because, Young, you point out that like none of the overtly progressive shows I could name would even fall into the label that I used. So once again, as comedy scientists, you have helpfully disproved my hypothesis and made us smarter.
I'm happy to provide my technically funny point of view anytime you need it.
You're welcome. And Jeff, I also very much appreciate your legally funny point of view. So thank you very much. Jeff, where can people find you?
I might be wrong.substack.com. Articles and my podcast are there. And that's where you can find me.
Wonderful. Young, do you have any projects that you would like to push on the audience?
Yes. I have a solo history podcast with every-time guest Andrew Heaton. That's you.
That's right, yes.
Where we talk about losers, pretenders, and scoundrels, which is coincidentally the name of the podcast. People who've either had a bad run in history, tried to screw other people in history, or pretended to be someone they were not in history. And we, try to give a accurate yet hopefully funny interpretation of who these people were.
And yes, as you point out, I am apparently not the host. I'm the permanent guest on Losers, Pretenders, and Scoundrels, and frequently co-opt the mic from you. And also, fun fact, I was just in New York on the History Channel being funny. So I am now funny in the field of history, which makes total sense for me at this point in my life. And let's hope that turns into something. Guys, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.